Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's Notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil for yet another engaging conversation.
Welcome. In this deep dive, we're going to take a really close look at President Trump's communication style, specifically during this current second term.
That's right. Our goal today is trying to understand how his language, his way of communicating really functions right now, in the current political environment.
So we're looking at his rhetoric, his strategies, based on what we're observing day to day in this ongoing term.
Exactly. We're analyzing patterns, factual events, and the impact they seem to be having. And what really emerges is, well, a consistent set of strategies that appear quite deliberate.
Okay, so the core argument we're exploring here isn't just about casual remarks. It's suggesting his language is perhaps a tool.
Precisely. The analysis suggests it's used intentionally to normalize certain kinds of behavior and to chip away at established democratic norms.
So it's not just the content, the specific words.
No, it's also the how he says things, the patterns, the repetition, and the cumulative effects of all that.
Got it. So let's start with this idea of consistency. His style seems, well, very consistent, unchanging almost.
Yeah, that's a key observation. The consistency is really notable, and the analysis connects this to certain, let's say, identified personality traits.
What kind of traits are we talking about?
Things like being ambitious, maybe exploitative, which hints at narcissistic tendencies like, grandiosity, needing admiration, also being quite outgoing, impulsive even.
Okay.
And then there's a dominant, controlling aspect alongside being, well, dauntless or adventurous, willing to take risks.
Right. And how do these psychological aspects actually show up in his communication? How do we see them?
You see them manifest quite clearly. The narcissistic side comes through in the frequent self-praise, the exaggeration of achievements, this constant focus on grievances, times he feels unfairly treated.
Okay. And the impulsiveness.
That leads to pronouncements that often seem unfiltered, just sort of said on the fly. The dominance translates into a very authoritative style, often dismissing other views. And the risk-taking. Well, that seems linked to his willingness to bend the truth, to challenge conventional political speech.
This leads to this concept mentioned in the analysis, the orange mask. What's that about?
The orange mask is a term used to describe this incredibly consistent public persona he maintains, regardless of the setting.
So whether it's a rally or social media or a formal address.
Exactly. The core characteristics, the aggression, the grievance, the unwavering self-belief, they remain pretty much the same. This results in something called context collapse.
Context collapse.
Yeah, where the usual lines between formal presidential communication and, say, informal rally talk just kind of blur together. It all sounds quite similar.
Interesting. So even if he uses like regional slang at a rally.
Right. You might see those minor linguistic tweaks, little variations perhaps tailored to the audience, but they seem superficial.
The core message, the persona, stays the same.
That's the observation. The core remains characterized by that aggression, the focus on perceived slights, and this intense self-confidence. It doesn't fundamentally shift.
And this very rigidity, this lack of change, is actually seen as a positive by his supporters.
Well, the analysis suggests that's how his base often interprets it. They see it as authenticity, as strength. Unlike conventional politicians who might carefully tailor their message.
So the unchanging nature itself becomes the message.
In a way, yes. It reinforces his image as an outsider, someone not playing by the usual political rules. His consistency reads as genuine to them.
What are the broader implications of this, though, this predictability?
Well, it has a couple of effects. His rhetoric reliably energizes his base. They know what to expect. But that same predictability tends to alienate those outside his base. It makes traditional political engagement, like debate or compromise, really difficult.
Because his style doesn't really allow for that back and forth.
It makes it harder, definitely. He tends to impose his dominant style, and over time, that actually starts to reshape public expectations of how a president should communicate, how they should behave.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the use of falsehoods. The analysis mentions this concept of the fire hose of falsehood. Can you unpack that?
Sure. The fire hose of falsehood isn't just about telling lies, it's a specific technique. It involves pumping out a very high volume of false or misleading statements, doing it rapidly and repeating them constantly.
And the goal isn't necessarily to make people believe each specific lie.
Not always, no. The primary aim seems to be creating confusion, sowing doubt, making people uncertain about what's true and what isn't. It's designed to overwhelm fact-checking efforts and just generally muddy the waters.
So it's about volume and speed, creating a kind of information fog.
That's a good way to put it. For instance, think about the debates around new regulations this year in 2025. We're seeing a constant stream of very simplistic, often factually questionable claims about supposedly catastrophic impacts.
Just repeated over and over.
Repeated across different platforms, yeah. It makes it really hard for people, especially supporters looking for confirmation, to sort through it all and find reliable information.
And repetition itself is a key part of this strategy.
Absolutely crucial. Repeating simple, emotionally resonant phrases or claims helps embed them. It cultivates what the analysis calls emotional truths.
Emotional truths, meaning they feel true
Yeah.
even if they aren't factually accurate.
Exactly. They bypass rational analysis. The appeal shifts heavily towards emotion pathos and the perceived credibility of the speaker ethos rather than logic or evidence logos.
And this ties into loyalty, believing these things, even when discredited.
It appears so. Accepting statements that are known to be false can become, in a way, a badge of loyalty, a demonstration of commitment to the leader and the movement.
Which strengthens the bond.
Yes, it strengthens that bond and can make followers more receptive to further messaging and less inclined to trust outside sources or factual corrections.
The analysis also points to hyperbole, extreme exaggeration in absolute terms. How do those fit in?
They're used constantly. Words like always, never, everyone, nobody, total disaster, the greatest ever. This serves to frame complex issues in really stark black and white terms.
Good versus evil. Us versus them.
Pretty much. It simplifies reality into these binary oppositions, which naturally polarizes the audience. And this is often amplified by using mockery, ridicule, and insults.
We hear that frequently, name-calling like dogs, losers, or labeling groups enemies of the people.
Yes, and sometimes techniques like apophasis, where you say you're not going to mention something, but you mention it anyway, are used to demean and delegitimize opponents.
So repetition, hyperbole, mockery
Yeah.
all work together.
Synergistically, yes. The repetition makes the hyperbole feel more familiar, the hyperbole injects strong emotion, and the mockery aims to dismiss opposition. The combined effect is to establish emotional dominance and push factual considerations into the background, eroding fact-based discourse.
It sounds like a deliberate strategy to control the narrative. Now, let's dig into this joke suggestion action pipeline. That sounds like a fascinating dynamic.
It's identified as a really key tactic, particularly in the second term, for normalizing ideas that might initially seem quite extreme.
How does it start? The joke part.
It often begins with an outrageous statement, maybe floated offhandedly at a rally or in a social media post. It's presented in a way that could be interpreted as just kidding or being provocative.
Like testing the waters.
Exactly. It lets him gauge the reaction without fully committing. If there's a huge backlash, it can be walked back, oh, I was just joking, or people are too sensitive, the Trump being Trump defense.
Plausible deniability.
Right. And crucially, this joke framing can disarm critics initially. They might dismiss it as not serious, which creates a delay, a lag in effective opposition if the idea resurfaces later.
Okay, so what happens after the joke tests the waters? What's the suggestion phase?
If the initial reaction isn't too severe, or if the idea actually gets some traction, it's then introduced more formally, maybe as a suggestion worth exploring, or something aides are looking into.
How might that look?
It could be allied commentators discussing its merits, or maybe carefully placed leaks suggesting the administration is seriously considering it. It moves from offhand remark to actual topic of discussion.
And the final step is action.
Yes, that's the implementation. An executive order, maybe proposed legislation, new administrative rules. The key is the progression.
Each step makes the next seem less radical.
That's the idea. It gradually shifts the Overton window, the range of policies considered acceptable. By the time the action phase arrives, the initial shock value has worn off somewhat, resistance might be softened, and what was once unthinkable starts to feel, well, more normal.
The analysis provides some specific examples in Table 1. Could you walk us through one, maybe the one about expanding presidential pardon power?
Sure. So the joke phase might be an off-the-cuff remark, maybe on social media, musing about pardoning certain controversial figures, perhaps framed as fighting back against perceived injustices.
Testing the reaction again.
Right. Then, in the suggestion phase, you might see supportive legal commentators publishing opinion pieces, arguing for a very broad interpretation of the pardon power, maybe framing it as a necessary check on other branches.
Laying the groundwork.
Exactly. And finally, the action phase could be the actual issuance of pardons that are clearly politically motivated, justified using the arguments floated earlier. The observed impact. Using pardons for political ends becomes more normalized, potentially weakening the norm of equal justice.
That really clarifies the process. It's methodical. Introduce something extreme, gauge the response, formalize it a bit, then implement it, all while opposition might be muted or desensitized.
It's described as a way to wear down resistance over time.
Okay, let's move to what the analysis calls narrative warfare, focusing on blame, victimhood, and dominance. How do these themes work together?
Well, President Trump's communication, especially now in his second term, is framed as this constant narrative battle, and these three themes are central. He consistently portrays himself, and by extension his supporters, as perpetual victims.
Victims.
Yes.
Even though he's the president.
Yes. Victims of a supposedly corrupt establishment, woke ideology, a biased media, the deep state, you name it. This narrative fosters a really strong sense of solidarity and loyalty within his base. It's an us against the world feeling.
And this victimhood narrative serves a purpose beyond just building loyalty.
Definitely. It works to deflect any criticism. If he or his administration is criticized, it's framed as just more proof of the persecution they're facing. It also serves to justify aggressive actions against those designated as the persecutors.
The scapegoats.
Exactly. The analysis highlights the systematic identification and vilification of scapegoats. Immigrants, political opponents, media outlets, international groups, sometimes minority groups. Blaming them for societal problems shifts responsibility away from his administration.
And solidifies the in-group.
Right. It unites his supporters against a common, vilified other. This is a classic feature of authoritarian populist rhetoric, that sharp us versus them dynamic.
Okay, so that's blame and victimhood. How does dominance fit in?
Dominance is asserted emotionally by constantly reframing events, any event, around his persona, his grievances, or his perceived triumphs. He demands emotional focus and allegiance.
So everything revolves around him.
That's the effect. And his style, often described as irreverent or politically incorrect, projects this image of someone speaking forbidden truths, challenging the status quo. This resonates strongly with people who feel ignored or marginalized.
Especially the analysis notes, with a sense of aggrieved, ethno-nationalist masculinity.
That connection is drawn, yes. It taps into a feeling among some groups that their status or identity is under threat. And it creates this interesting inversion of power dynamics.
How so?
You have the incumbent president, the most powerful person in the country, successfully portraying himself as an underdog, an outsider fighting against powerful, entrenched forces. This energizes his base and justifies attacks on established institutions and norms.
It's a potent combination. This constant sense of struggle, blame, and being under siege seems designed to maintain high levels of engagement and loyalty. Which leads us to the next point. The erosion of resistance through desensitization and what's called narrative chaos.
Right. The argument is that this sustained rhetorical assault, this constant barrage, actually wears down public and institutional resistance over time.
How does that happen? We touched on the Overton window shifting.
Exactly. Constant exposure to rhetoric and actions that violate norms gradually makes them seem less shocking, less abnormal.
Yeah.
Think about the discourse around the judiciary or the press now compared to, say, 10 years ago. Things are said and proposed routinely now that would have been unthinkable then.
So we just get used to it.
That's the process of desensitization. It's argued that this isn't just a side effect, it's actively cultivated. Each norm violation diminishes the capacity for outrage, making the next one easier to accept. It's like a ratchet effect.
And this taps into our own psychology.
Yes, the analysis points to cognitive biases. Confirmation bias, for example, we tend to accept information that confirms what we already believe. So supporters readily accept the repeated slogans and claims.
And the availability heuristic.
Right. Simple, memorable slogans or falsehoods that are repeated constantly come to mind easily and are given more weight than complex factual rebuttals. It's easier to process.
There's also mention of emotional contagion.
Yeah, the idea that emotions, especially strong negative ones like anger and fear, can spread through social networks. The adversarial narratives fuel this, creating a kind of echo chamber of grievance and hostility.
And the sheer volume and speed contribute to narrative chaos.
Precisely. The sheer amount of communication, its speed, and its often contradictory nature just overwhelms the capacity for sustained, focused critique. It's hard to keep up, hard to fact-check everything, hard to maintain outrage.
So preferred narratives can persist simply because they're hard to effectively counter amidst all the noise.
That's the argument. This chaos fosters a kind of performative immunity. It allows him to evade conventional accountability because by the time one controversy is being analyzed, 3 new ones have erupted. And it feeds into that defense of, oh, that's just Trump being Trump.
Which brings us neatly to deconstructing those common defenses. The analysis argues these defenses, like he's just joking, are actually quite dangerous.
Yes, it tackles several common ways his rhetoric is excused or minimized, and it notes that Trump himself has sometimes described his style as intentional, even a mark of genius.
So let's start with he's just joking. Why is that considered a fallacy here?
The analysis points to real-world examples where things initially framed as jokes maybe about challenging alliances or certain domestic policies later became serious discussions or actual policy.
So dismissing it as a joke misses the potential trajectory.
Exactly, and amplifying that just joking frame actually helps the normalization process. It lowers the guard against the idea if and when it reappears more seriously.
What about that's just his style? Or he's impulsive, he doesn't mean it strategically.
The counterargument is, look at the patterns, look at the consistency, look at who gets targeted. The attacks aren't random. They often serve clear political goals, like mobilizing the base or delegitimizing opponents. The rhetoric has documented political utility, suggesting it's more than just unfiltered impulse.
And the idea that supporters take him seriously but not literally?
The analysis argues this is insufficient. It points to the tangible consequences of his rhetoric, the documented links between inflammatory language and increases in political hostility or even threats of violence. Emotional incitement has real effects, even if the literal words aren't always parsed like a legal document.
Then there's the authenticity defense. He's just being real, not polished like other politicians.
The critique here is that authenticity is used to lower the bar for accountability. It excuses potentially harmful content misinformation, insults, divisive language, simply because it's delivered without traditional political polish. This undermines the basic expectation that public leaders should communicate responsibly and truthfully.
So the intent behind the words is less important than their actual impact.
That's the core point. The focus should be on the observable consequences for democratic norms, public trust, political stability. Dismissing the language for whatever reason joking, impulsive, authentic, provides cover for behaviors and ideas that can erode democratic foundations.
Okay, so wrapping this up, the conclusion emphasizes these linguistic patterns as footprints, signs of democratic unraveling.
Yes. The summary is that the analysis shows a systematic, deliberate use of these rhetorical strategies during this second term, and that this has significantly reshaped discourse, eroded trust, and normalized behaviors associated with authoritarianism.
And the key strategies again were?
Repetition, hyperbole, disinformation, that fire hose effect, mockery, creating victimhood narratives, scapegoating specific groups, and that methodical joke-to-decree pipeline.
And these aren't just temporary shifts in language.
The argument is that these linguistic footprints represent a potentially lasting change in American political communication. The normalization of extreme rhetoric and the desensitization of the public, these things are hard to undo. They leave scars on the democratic process.
And could set a precedent.
Potentially, yes. The perceived success of these methods in mobilizing a base could encourage other political actors to adopt similar tactics, leading to a broader coarsening of public discourse and a systemic weakening of democratic norms like deliberation, compromise, and respect for facts.
So this analysis isn't speculation about the future, but a record of erosion happening now in this second term.
Correct. It's presented as an assessment based on the current reality, highlighting a profound challenge to democratic resilience.
And the takeaway is the need to recognize and counter this.
Exactly. The conclusion stresses the vital civic responsibility of understanding how this manipulative rhetoric works, recognizing the architecture of autocratic language, as it's put, and reaffirming a commitment to truth, respect, and accountability is presented as essential. Understanding these tools is seen as the first step toward repairing democratic life.
That's a very thorough breakdown. Thank you for walking us through this analysis of President Trump's communication in his second term. It certainly gives a lot to think about regarding our current political language.
You're welcome. It's definitely crucial for you listening, to be aware of these patterns.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.